If you crack first, Dave, it won't make you any less of a man.
I'm nowhere near cracking.
Neither am I, my friend.
Dave. And Matthew, what is it now? For God's sake, no one's smoking, okay? But nothing! You know what we need around here is an anti-whining ordinance. So just sip your sniveling little lip and haul your skinny ass out of here!
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes. As a lot of you know, I am a big fan of Jonathan Hickman, his indie work. Also, I was very enamored by his House of X Powers of 10, basically relaunch of the X-Men series. We covered it quite extensively here on the channel. We had like 2 or 3 programs each week, just covering just the one comic, just to talk about it, because we enjoyed it so much. Eventually, things did change. We know that Jonathan Hickman is exiting. He's no longer really a part of the X-Men after his Inferno series, which starts up here pretty soon, which will be done by the end of the year. But he's starting to talk again. He basically went silent for like a year and a half, maybe a little bit longer than that. He left social media. He stopped doing interviews. But once he started up his Substack, and it was announced that he was leaving X-Men, he started talking again. This is the second interview I think he's had with Adventures Import Days. There will be a link to the entire conversation in the video description, because I'm only going to cover so much of it. There's only so much of it I've personally found interesting, and it is actually a long interview. So if you want to read everything and his entire answers, or his answers in their entirety, go check out the video description. I'm going to talk about the questions I thought were interesting, his answers, and my thoughts on those. I agree with some of them. Some of them are enlightening. He talked specifically, I thought the most interesting stuff was the X-Slack, the writer's room, the collaboration that they did, whether or not he thought it was successful. He also talks about some of his regrets and the things he wasn't able to tackle before he exited X-Men, and just a couple other decisions that he made that I wanted to talk about here. So let's cover them. Let's get right to it, because there's quite a bit to do. The first question that I'm going to talk about says, do you think the writer's room concept was more successful than you expected? And Hickman said, I think it worked in a lot of ways that were intended. I think there are also things we got wrong or could have done better. I think if our goals were a cohesive line, integrated storylines, and a profitable line of books for the company, sure, for the most part, it worked out great. I would disagree with him on a couple of fronts. I do think it was likely a very profitable line, especially at the beginning. As far as the integrated, cohesive storylines, no. Like, if you get up to their events, that's where you're thinking cohesive storylines and things integrating. Go read, Ten of Swords. That thing is a absolute mess, because you have Jonathan Hickman telling his Krakoa Arako original Four Horsemen story and integrating the stupid freaking Otherworld story that Teenie Howard was doing, and they did not mix. And it was a jumbled mess, and it has some of the worst issues of X-Men that have been released in the past 5 years. It wasn't cohesive, and it wasn't integrated. It was awful. That's why it was disjointed storytelling. You can go listen to my reviews and the wrap-up of it. That was the big complaint about that one. Now, as far as profitable, I think that probably worked. And just across the line, the Wolverine and X-Force, yeah, those were pretty cohesive. They certainly were crossing over because they had the same writer, but nothing else seemed to mix. It was weird. Even Jonathan Hickman's own writing didn't seem to mix with itself. It was strange. He continued on answering that question. And while I do think those are the most important things for it to be truly successful, I think we need a couple more things to go right. The first thing he cites is not going right. I believe we need a broader aesthetic, a bigger artistic umbrella. That's something we perhaps could have controlled a little bit better. I'll agree with that one. There were too many Stuart Immonen clones. There were a couple of titles that had their own vibe, like the Josh Guerrero stuff on X-Force, and even the New Mutant stuff with, was it Reese? Rod Reese, I think. Those actually look different, but everything else kind of was like, they kind of look the same. So they got too many Stuart Immonen clones. I'll give them that. Most of the titles didn't have their own feel to them until a little bit later on. And the second thing he identifies is, I think we needed to maintain a more relentless velocity. Narrative rhythm is good, necessary, I think, in the individual titles, but with the line as big as ours, the whole thing still has to feel like a freight train. The pandemic really screwed us up there, and along with other complications, it's taken us until now to get everything back on track. So while some might think that that's one we deserve some grace on, I probably argue that grace isn't something you get to ask for in financial exchange. But overall, I think it worked well. I'll give us a B. I would give them at best, as far as like cohesion and working together as a line, and this writer's room concept, which is not really a writer's room. I would give it like a D or maybe a C minus, because there were times when it did work, and when it worked, it was good. But for the most part, nothing worked. And he's right about this freight train. There were times where you could tell that they needed to meet up at Ten of Swords, and there were comics that nothing was happening. They were just filler upon filler, and they were Jonathan Hickman's own comics that were doing it. He was part of that problem, and they weren't like meeting up to have this big blowout event. And then you think about like the Hellfire Gala. When you read House of X Powers of 10, what's it? It's like it's promising all these great sci-fi concepts, and we got this and this. And we're going to be combining all these things, and then it's like, well, your second big event is a fucking dinner party. Get out of here, man. No, you don't get a B for that, and he knows that. He's being nice to his collaborators, in my opinion, by giving him a B. They deserve a D, maybe a C minus, because for the most part, it didn't work. And I kind of blame him, although he definitely checked out early, and it's basically been the Jordan Peterson, the Jordan White show for quite some time. There is another question. Here it is. Do you plan to stick around the X-Slack, or does Jordan, i.e. Jordan White, disable your account the second Inferno 4 goes on sale? And Jonathan says, I'm actually the owner of the X-Slack, so I think the move for me is to lock everyone out after our X-Men Summit ends this week. Yes, do that. The X-Slack needs to go. It's been a terrible, it has not worked out the way people anticipated. I think it's been a terrible hindrance for the entire X-Men line, because no one's held accountable anymore. And I think it's one of the key reasons Jonathan Hickman's actually leaving, is because apparently once you get in the X-Slack, you don't, like, they just keep you around. If you're Leah Williamson, you can't sell a goddamn comic book. Now you're writing the Trial of Magneto, which is an absolute disaster. If you're Jerry Duggan and you're not a very good comic book writer, but once you had a run on Deadpool that was semi-successful, and Jonathan Hickman just decided to hit the eject button, get the hell out of there, you can't bring in a more established writer to take over X-Men. You're just going to give it to Jerry Duggan. Okay. What the hell are you guys talking about? Jerry Duggan doesn't deserve to write the third string Spider-Man title, let alone a franchise, like a tentpole like X-Men. He hasn't earned that. But because of this stupid X-Slack and the fact that you can't leave, apparently, unless you're Jonathan Hickman, he somehow has been elevated. It's beyond ridiculous. I think it's blown up in their face. I know there are other offices within Marvel that have asked for this treatment, i.e. we want a Spider-Man Slack so we can control all our Spider-Man in-house, and Marvel has been like, nah, because they can see that this has been an unmitigated disaster and has had far more unintended consequences to their detriment than to the positive. Let's put it that way. He continues on. This one's a pretty interesting question. Are there any story beats or characters you regret you didn't get around to working on? Obviously, Jonathan Hickman was supposed to be on X-Men for 3 years. He's leaving much earlier. We're supposed to see like it's supposed to be a trilogy. We're still in the first act. We never got to see the second and third act. But this is what Hickman had to say. Character-wise, I had to pull all the Rogue stuff out of Inferno, and I'm pretty bummed about that. We just didn't have the real estate. And he talks about he was going to have to add an issue or make it bigger, which was going to bring in artists. Okay, he didn't get the Rogue stuff in Inferno. It doesn't feel like Rogue was ever supposed to be important. Like, he didn't do anything cool with Rogue during his X-Men time anyway. She was basically just over there with Excalibur being misused by Tini Howard. And he goes on to continue. Overall, there are a couple of concepts that either didn't work out. One was going to be a Children of the Vault book, which I would have loved. Another was an Imperial Guard thing, or were changed at the last minute because of the character conflicts or direction changes, i.e. the giant-sized books, but nothing else really comes to mind. A Children of the Vault book by Hickman himself or by Cy Spurrier, who's done really awesome on Way of X, would have been phenomenal. That would have been great. Like, that It's just, the line was too big by this point. You can't be adding a niche book like the Children of the Vault. It would have had to be like a mini series. It still would have fell by the wayside because the line was just so enormous at that point that, where was there room for a Children of the Vault book? But a book like that was needed because it would have felt like House of X Powers of 10. That's why when you saw Children of the Vault in X-Men, which I think it's issue 5 or 6, I think it's 5 and 6 and 18, 19. That felt cool. It felt like it was supposed to be there. Maybe it's 6, 18, and 19. I think 5 is actually when we find out that Nimrod is coming online. So I think I mistook that one. I think it's 6, 18, and 19. That stuff felt like it was supposed to be there. That felt like boom, boom, boom. Jonathan Hickman's hitting on all cylinders. To keep up the momentum after House of X Powers of 10, which they completely destroyed, in my opinion, they needed a book like that. And it feels like Way of X has done that. We're finally getting into some of that interesting stuff. You got good storytelling from a competent writer, which has been, for the most part, missing through a lot of the X-Men books. So I would have loved that. Also, I'm not surprised to see him mention the giant-sized books. Those were unmitigated. Oh, they weren't a disaster. They weren't terrible, but it's like, why am I paying giant-sized prices for these comic books? None of this stuff seems to matter. There were a couple of interesting concepts, but at the end, you just came away underwhelmed, and he was selling it at the beginning when he was still doing interviews like this stuff was going to be important. And I'm not surprised that they end up having to change directions and make a lot of changes to those giant-sized books because they didn't feel cohesive. In the end, they felt like an enormous waste of time, unless you really like the artists, and they definitely try to put good artists on those books. So I'm not shocked at all that something that Jonathan Hickman kind of sold as being important ended up feeling not important. He says, yeah, there were major changes. At the end, he also says there were some continuity mistakes, but hey, those things happen, especially when you're working with a team that large. But, I would love to see the Children of the Vault book. The Imperial Guard thing, I'm not as high on that one, I guess, but I think it would have worked out probably better than most of what we got. And yeah, you can definitely tell the giant-sized books weren't what they were supposed to be. There's another question. What made the Moira Mystique Destiny story the logical choice, talking about Inferno? And he says, it's the correct pivot point, and that's the way people should probably think about it, especially with what the line is going to look like after Ben's 10 Lives and 10 Deaths of Wolverine starting in January. That's a very key information right there. We know 10 Lives, 10 Deaths is going to be like 12 issues like House of X Powers of 10 coming out weekly, so for 3 months. And that most of the X-Men titles are going to stop moving along. So whatever happens in 10 Lives and 10 Deaths is like the next impetus, like to push this X-Men line forward and whatever the line's going to be after this. So that's the reason that's the pivot point, and the reason that they're shutting down a lot of the other titles while it's happening. Obviously, we will be getting Sabretooth and a couple other comics. So expect after the 10 Lives, 10 Deaths of Wolverine books to when those are complete, something major, at least according to Hickman, is going to happen, and it's going to be pushing the narrative of X-Men forward. I've heard a lot of people believing it's going to be the second age of Krakoa, because everyone's been talking about like Dawn of X, Reign of X is the first age of Krakoa. I don't get that one, because I thought like Hickman said he was leaving because the writers didn't want to leave the first age of Krakoa. He wanted to move into the second act of his book, but they wanted to stay in the first. Perhaps the second age of Krakoa was supposed to be within the first act. I'm not really sure. But he also does mention that a lot of his ideas that he wanted to execute over this 3-year like X-Men time, they are going to be incorporated. At least they are there to be incorporated by the X-Men team under Jordan White. We shall see what they incorporate. There's just nobody in there, maybe than like a Zeb Wells or a Cy Spurrier, that could probably, like, even I like Ben Percy, but he doesn't write like Hickman. That's why I'm a little bit leery of this 10 Lives, 10 Deaths. Like he doesn't. He's not a big picture guy like Hickman is. Ben Percy is a mystery box guy. There's something out there that needs to be discovered, and then when you discover it, you find out there's another mystery box that's 4 issues down the road, and you keep moving along. That's how he tells his comic books. I hate to break it to you if you haven't noticed that. That's not how Jonathan Hickman tells his stories. His things are a lot more complicated. They're multi-layered, and sometimes they're overwhelming, and you need to read them 2 or 3 times just to get them. You don't need to read a Ben Percy comic more than once to get the gist. Like, you got it. So I don't know. Maybe Wolverine's the right character. I don't know that Ben's going to be the right writer, but Cy Spurrier definitely works more on that level, but not as good in my opinion. And then I think Zeb Wells, maybe not quite on that level of complexity, but he can do that. But I think he's a better, I don't know, like an action storyteller than Hickman. Hickman has issues with characterization. He doesn't build a lot of characters, and it feels like Zeb Wells is great with that kind of stuff. His character work is probably the best in the entire X-Men office. It's unfortunate that he's leaving, with the end of Hellions, but I imagine he's going to be a dominating force within the Spider-Man line. So I guess that's a promotion, because Spider-Man's the flagship. So we shall see about that pivot point. He was asked, what is your favorite single issue you wrote in your run? I can tell you right now, as far as the X-Men run that he had, my favorite issue is his last one, X-Men number 20, with all that Nimrod stuff and Mystique and Destiny. Obviously, that's leading right into Inferno. That's one of the reasons I'm so excited, because those issues, issue 5 and issue 20, are just like breathtaking. Like, that is good stuff. That is what we were excited about for Jonathan Hickman X-Men to be. He names neither of those. He answers, I assume you mean from X-Men, so I'd probably say that Crucible issue X-Men number 7, that was a pretty solid comic. It was a solid comic, but it certainly wasn't among the best, but it's one of his favorite. I don't particularly like the idea of the Crucible. I thought it was kind of odious, to be completely honest. And we saw that kind of play out. It's obvious that Cy Spurrier felt the same way when he was portraying the younger mutants at the beginning of Way of X, like kind of daring each other to die, kind of like in the Way of the Crucible, because they'd seen it so many times. And I thought it was kind of gross. And you could see that it definitely affected Nightcrawler. So if that was Jonathan's intention to have effects of that later on, that it was solid storytelling. But it wasn't one of my favorite personal singles. The other one he talks about, my favorite issue overall, was House of X number 5. That was a fun book to write because it was just knocking down things I'd spent issues setting up. It was all dunks front to back. I could understand that. My favorite issue out of that whole thing, I don't think it was my best issue of the year. I think that was actually Man and Superman, that Marv Wolfman thing. But House of X number 4, I think, is the best one out of the House of X Powers of 10 series, because you get that great scene with Wolverine and Nightcrawler on Orcus, and you get that great, basically them storming the space station to take out Nimrod and to take out the Mother Mold to basically prevent Nimrod from ever coming online. And I just thought that one was great. Issue 5, obviously, is when we realize resurrection is the resurrection protocols are in. He explains all of it. And yes, he is knocking stuff out. He's like, boom, boom, boom. Let me show you my work and where this was all leading to. I can see how that was probably more exciting for him. But as a reader, I think House of X4 was way better, way more satisfying. And House of X5 was like more of a game changer, just as far as the future of the X-Men under Hickman. The final question, I kind of like the answer that he gave to this one, because I think I kind of disagree with the questioner here. What was it like to finally canonize Mystique and Destiny's relationship, and follow up? What makes this pair so compelling to you as a writer? Chris Claremont has talked about those were queer-coded characters. We'd seen them kiss prior. Like, we knew that they were in a relationship. We may not have known that they were married, but he was just confirming things that everyone already knew. But Hickman essentially says that. He says, well, they're an amazing power couple, but the thing I latched onto once I figured out how resurrection would work was who wasn't there, and more importantly, who's been gone a long time. So you can see why Mystique and Destiny would take a front role. And then he continues, Destiny, being a precog, also locked into the secret failed future of mutantdom, and was therefore immediately adversarial to Moira, and by extension Xavier and Magneto. That it painted Mystique into being on the other side of things from the jump made it kind of perfect. Also, just as the visuals go, Destiny is a Tierwood look. Can't leave that up on the shelf. He's absolutely right. That's the most intriguing thing left, I guess, of all the stuff that's there for Hickman to handle, this Mystique, Destiny, Magneto, Moira, Charles thing, like that's the most intriguing thing that he hasn't covered, and I imagine that's why it's in Inferno. But he does kind of talk about the canonization of the relationship. He said, I had no idea until Jordan told me. I knew it was supposed to be a big deal that Mark Waid wrote them kissing, but I honestly thought it was just a show it on the page kind of thing. I assumed that they were always a couple because that's how Chris Claremont depicted them when I read it. And he's right. That's how he depicted it, and that was by design. They were queer-coded characters. You were supposed to see those characters in Chris Claremont's X-Men as a couple. He just wasn't able to flat out say it at the time. So I agree with him there. As far as canonizing the relationship, I guess the fact that they're married, that was bring me back my wife kind of thing. That was the first time we'd seen that word, but no one reacted to that because everyone already knew that they were a couple. They're like, yeah. Oh, they were married. Didn't realize that part. Otherwise, it was good storytelling because the relationship was there. It was established, and that's what you don't get in a lot of modern day comic books. Is there's no establishment of the stakes or the foundation of the relationships for when these things happen for them to mean something. So when it happened in X-Men, I think it's 5 or 6. I think it's 5. Bring me back my wife. That line, it meant so much more, and it was impactful. Because it was creating on a foundation that had already been set by Chris Claremont, and I think that was excellent work by Jonathan Hickman. And I it sucks that he's gone. I do like reading these and getting some more information and some insight into his thoughts as he's leaving. I imagine if you could get Hickman out to a bar and gave him a beer and it's like, really, do you think the collaboration was really a B? On your X-Men line? He's like, nah, there's no way. Things just didn't work out like they should have. But he is a nice guy. He's not going to throw his collaborators under the bus. We know that he has a relationship with many of them. Teeny Howard's going with him to his Substack line, and he wants to keep these relationships. So he's not going to throw him under the bus. But if he thought the collaboration was great and it was working out well, he wouldn't be leaving. You know what I mean? Actions speak louder than words. He's jettisoning years before he was supposed to be, without telling his full story, because he could see there's no reason for me to be here anymore. This isn't working out the way I needed it to. So those are my thoughts. I hope you enjoyed this. Like I said, there is a link in the link in the video description if you want to read the full interview. There's a lot more questions in there. There's also excerpts from different writers in the X-Men office talking about their time with Jonathan Hickman and what he meant to them. I didn't find any of them quite interesting. Plus, I know some behind-the-scenes details that don't line up exactly with what they're saying. But hey, you're going to be nice when you're doing interviews and stuff. So that's that. And I hope you enjoyed that. Sid, we'll talk to you later. Maybe we'll see what Doc. We're not going to throw this to Doc. I just covered this thing for 25 minutes. I'll see you at This Week at X-Men on Sunday.